The emergency meeting had barely started when the janitor set down his mop and walked to the front of the room. Every executive, every manager, every intern watched in silence as the man in the gray uniform reached up and unpinned his name tag, the one that read Ryan, and placed it flat on the conference table. He straightened his posture and looked across the room with the kind of calm that only belongs to someone who has nothing left to prove. "My name is Harrison Blake," he said. "I own this company." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because 1 week earlier, these same people had ordered him to clean their floors. Harrison Blake had built Blake Horizon Logistics from a single freight contract into one of the largest transportation networks on the East Coast. He had done it by working longer hours than anyone beneath him, by making decisions other people were too afraid to make, and by trusting the structure he spent 2 decades assembling. The company ran. The numbers climbed. The quarterly reports landed clean. And yet somewhere between the growth charts and the executive summaries, something had gone quiet in a way he couldn't name. He lived alone in a corner unit on the 32nd floor of a building 12 minutes from headquarters. After his divorce, the apartment had become less of a home and more of a place where he stored his suits and his insomnia. Work filled the space that everything else had left behind, and for a long time, that had felt like enough. It was only recently reading reports he no longer fully believed that he had started to wonder what exactly he was working so hard to protect. The reports had been arriving for months. Culture assessment scores in the top 10% of the industry. Employee satisfaction ratings above benchmark. A glossy internal newsletter with photographs of team-building retreats and smiling managers holding awards. The language was polished, the data was formatted, and every number pointed upward. Harrison had read all of it the way a man reads a menu in a language he doesn't quite speak, understanding the words, missing the taste. Then the anonymous letter arrived. It had been printed, not typed, and slipped into the internal mail system without a sender. Whoever wrote it had been careful. The letter described a company where hard work was invisible unless it came wrapped in the right performance, where managers rewarded loyalty to themselves over results for the business, and where the people who asked honest questions were quietly moved to the margins. It described in plain and exhausted language a workplace that had learned to look healthy without being healthy. Harrison read it twice. Then he read the culture reports again. The distance between the 2 documents was wide enough to drive a truck through. He did not call a meeting. He did not forward the letter to HR. What he did was go down to the facilities office on the basement level at 6:30 in the morning, before most of the building had arrived, and speak with the maintenance supervisor, a quiet man named Gerald, who had worked in the building for 11 years. Gerald looked at him the way people look at someone who has clearly never asked for anything inconvenient before. But Harrison explained what he needed, and Gerald, after a long moment, agreed to help. By 7:15, Harrison Blake had a gray uniform, a laminated name tag that read Ryan Cole, and a schedule that would place him on floors 3 through 7 for 5 working days. He told his assistant he was traveling for due diligence. He forwarded his calls. He left his watch in the apartment. He kept one thing, a slim encrypted tablet locked in the bottom of the maintenance cart, the kind of device that looked like standard facilities inventory, but carried his CEO-level credentials. He would need it before the week was over. He didn't know exactly when. The first morning was disorienting in a way he hadn't expected. Not because the work was hard. It was repetitive and physical and unglamorous, but it was manageable. But because of how completely he disappeared. He had spent 20 years being recognized the moment he walked into any room in that building. Now he pushed a cart down the hallway outside his own conference room, and not a single person looked up. He was furniture. He was background. He was the hum of the ventilation system present, functional and entirely beneath notice. By the second day, he had stopped being surprised by it and started paying attention to what it revealed. The behavior people showed when they believed no one important was watching was clarifying in a way that no report could replicate. He watched a floor manager snap at a junior coordinator for interrupting a conversation then smooth his expression back into warmth the moment a senior director rounded the corner. He watched two employees in the break room dissect a third colleague's presentation with precision that was almost surgical, then greet that same colleague with enthusiasm when he appeared at the door. He listened to the language people used when they thought rank wasn't present. Casual, slightly meaner, more honest. What he did not see on those first 2 days was Evelyn Carter. He heard her name once mentioned in passing by someone who said she was the one who'd stayed until 10 the previous night, finishing the logistics framework for the intern strategy project. The tone wasn't admiring. It was somewhere between mildly impressed and faintly suspicious, as though staying until 10 voluntarily was evidence of some personal deficiency rather than commitment. He saw her for the first time on the third morning. She was standing at the printer on the 5th floor, waiting for a document stack to finish, holding a coffee cup with both hands, the way someone holds something warm when the rest of their day is cold. She was younger than he'd imagined from the second-hand mention mid-20s, quietly dressed with the particular posture of someone who had taught themselves not to take up too much space. When the printer jammed, she crouched down to fix it herself rather than calling anyone. She worked at it methodically without frustration, found the folded sheet, cleared it, and stood back up. She glanced over and noticed him watching. She smiled, not the automatic reflex smile of someone performing friendliness, but a small, real one, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. "That thing jams at least twice a day," she said. "I think it's protesting something." Harrison laughed before he thought about it. He couldn't remember the last time someone in that building had made him laugh without trying to. He learned her rhythm over the following days, the way you learn anyone's rhythm when you work in the same space, through repetition, through small accumulated detail. Evelyn arrived early and left late. She ate lunch at her desk more often than not, which he knew because he cleared the common areas in the afternoons, and her desk was always occupied, while others were empty. She worked without headphones, which was unusual among the interns. She kept a notepad beside her keyboard covered in handwriting that was small and dense, and organized in a way that looked less like notes and more like architecture. She also had a habit of noticing things other people didn't. Twice during that week, she asked him directly, not as an afterthought, not as small talk, but as an actual question, whether he'd taken a break, yet whether he'd had anything to eat. The first time it happened, he didn't know what to say. He was so unused to being asked that he stood there for a beat too long before answering. She didn't find it strange. She just accepted the answer and moved on the way considerate people do. A more significant moment came on Thursday afternoon, when two of the other interns, both of them, the kind of young men who moved through an office as though they already owned it, were loudly discussing the strategy project near the elevator bank. Harrison was cleaning the floor nearby, invisible as always. One of them was Caleb Foster. Harrison had already noticed Caleb. You noticed Caleb the way you noticed weather. He filled whatever room he occupied and made it subtly about himself without appearing to try. He was articulate and well-dressed and spoke to senior managers with the kind of easy familiarity that either came from confidence or from having spent significant time studying how confident people behave. Either way, it worked. Harrison had watched 3 separate managers light up in Caleb's presence over the past 3 days. What Caleb was saying now casually and without apparent self-consciousness was that the logistics restructuring proposal, the one generating quiet praise in the project's internal channel, had come together because of his push to rethink the routing intervals. He described the idea's origins in the first person. He used the word "my" 4 times in a single minute, and the other intern nodded along, and neither of them looked in Harrison's direction, and Harrison kept the mop moving and said nothing. But he remembered what the floor manager had told him on the second day, almost as an aside, that Evelyn had been working on that framework for 2 weeks before the project formally started. He found her that evening in the small conference room on the 5th floor that the interns used when the open-plan desks got too loud. She was alone, as she often was at that hour, working through a spreadsheet with a focus that made the room feel like it was designed specifically for her. Most of the floor was empty. The overhead lights had switched to their dimmed evening setting, and the only bright spot was the pool of light from her laptop screen and the desk lamp she'd dragged over from the corner. Harrison was collecting the recycling bins along the wall when she looked up and saw him. She closed the spreadsheet without making a point of it, not hiding anything, just giving the conversation her full attention. "Still here," she said. "Still here," he said. There was a kind of ease between them that he couldn't fully explain. It might have been the hour the building at that time of evening had a different texture, quieter and more honest, stripped of its daytime performance. Or it might have been that Evelyn simply didn't adjust her behavior based on who she was talking to. She spoke to him the same way she would have spoken to anyone. It was such a basic thing. It was remarkable only because no one else in that building had done it. She mentioned without complaint that the project deadline had moved up. She mentioned that she'd been refining the routing interval model because the initial figures had a flaw in how they accounted for peak hour variance. She didn't ask for credit. She didn't position it. She just described the problem and what she was doing to fix it. Harrison listened and understood with the clarity that comes from seeing something with fresh eyes, that he was looking at the most capable person in that intern cohort. He also understood that almost no one in a position to do anything about it had noticed. He asked her carefully whether the team had been working on the routing model together. She gave him a look, the kind that lands a half-second before the answer that tells you the person knows exactly what you were really asking. "We all contribute," she said, in the tone of someone who has learned that the truth isn't always worth the cost of saying it plainly. Harrison nodded. He finished collecting the bins and pushed the cart toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and told her without explanation that the work she was doing was solid. She looked briefly surprised, not flattered exactly, but caught off guard in the way people are when they hear something true and unexpected. She thanked him. He left, pushing the cart down the empty hallway, thinking about a company he had built and apparently never fully understood. Wednesday of that same week brought the company's quarterly internal gathering, not a formal event, just the kind of after-hours mixer that companies arrange to signal that they value connection, while also ensuring that the right people are seen connecting with the right other people. It was held on the 6th floor, which had an open lounge area with better furniture than the rest of the building. Harrison was assigned to work the perimeter, collecting empties, keeping the surfaces clean, refilling the ice at the bar station. He had expected it to be uncomfortable. It was worse than that. Caleb and 3 other interns took up a position near the center of the room, the gravitational middle, where visibility was highest and traffic was thickest. Within 20 minutes, Caleb had drawn in 2 directors and a VP, and was holding the kind of conversation that looked collaborative, but functioned as a performance. Harrison moved along the wall collecting glasses, listening to things he was not supposed to hear, because no one believed he was capable of understanding them. Earlier that same evening, before the mixer had fully started, Harrison had been mopping the hallway outside the main conference room when the intern project debrief let out. He could hear the energy before the door opened, the kind of controlled enthusiasm that people perform when they want the room to remember them as someone who generates momentum. Caleb came out first, speaking at volume to the floor director, a trim man named Patrick Sell, who wore his authority lightly and his preferences obviously. Caleb was describing the routing interval concept, Evelyn's concept, the one she had explained to Harrison 2 evenings earlier, as though it were a piece of himself. Not stolen exactly, absorbed, repackaged in his own vocabulary, and presented so naturally that even Harrison, who knew the truth, would have had a hard time pointing to the exact moment of theft. Evelyn came out near the end of the group, walking beside another intern and saying very little. Harrison watched her face as she heard Caleb hold court with Patrick. There was no visible anger, just a small, controlled stillness around her eyes that looked like someone who had already done the math on a situation and found the answer unfair, but not surprising. She had been here before. She knew how it ended. She just kept walking. Now at the mixer, that same dynamic was playing out at higher volume and with a larger audience. Caleb had locked in his position near the center of the room. Harrison moved along the perimeter and watched it with the particular attention of someone who has stopped being surprised and started keeping count. At some point, Harrison was at the bar station refilling the ice. Caleb's group began to migrate in his direction. The conversation had shifted to something lighter, looser, the way conversations shift when people feel secure in their audience. One of the other interns made a comment about a trash bag that had been left near the service door. Caleb glanced at Harrison, and something shifted in his posture, a slight expansion, the kind that happens when a person finds an audience and a target simultaneously. He said loud enough to carry that at least someone in the building knew what they were actually qualified to do. The group laughed. The two directors smiled in the non-committal way of people who don't endorse something, but aren't willing to spend any social currency opposing it either. Harrison set the ice down and said nothing. He had been in enough rooms to know that responding was exactly what the moment was designed to provoke. He kept his face neutral and moved to the next surface. Then, someone, whether it was Caleb or one of the others, Harrison could not say for certain, managed to tip a half-full glass of red wine in his direction as he reached past to collect an empty. The glass rolled off the ledge, and the wine went across the floor in a wide arc, and the group produced the kind of laughter that pretends to be accidental. One of the men pointed at the floor and told Harrison it needed cleaning, as though he might not have noticed. Evelyn had been across the room. Harrison had barely registered her presence during the event. She had positioned herself near the edges, near the quieter clusters, the way she always seemed to navigate spaces that didn't quite belong to her yet. But she had been watching, and she walked over before Harrison had moved for the mop. She crouched and began gathering the larger debris herself, picking up the glass, clearing what she could clear with a napkin. Then she straightened up and looked at the group directly. She was not loud. She didn't need to be. She said that she wasn't sure what was funny about it, and that regardless of what anyone's job title was in that building, nobody had the right to treat another person as a prop for their entertainment. She said it the way someone says something they've thought about for a long time, not impulsively, not performatively, but with the particular steadiness of a person who has decided that some things are worth the cost. The laughter around Caleb's group died at different speeds. One of the directors looked at the floor. Caleb's face did something complicated, and then settled into a neutral expression that was the social equivalent of a door quietly closing. Nobody said anything further. Evelyn handed Harrison the napkin, briefly met his eyes, and it was not pity in her expression. It was the plain acknowledgement of one human being to another, then returned to where she'd been standing. Harrison finished cleaning the floor. The event continued, but the temperature in the room had changed, and everyone in the immediate radius felt it. Harrison, for his part, felt something shift in himself that was harder to name. He had spent 20 years learning to be impressive, to be significant, to occupy space in a way that made other people stand at attention. He had forgotten somewhere along the way what it felt like to simply be treated decently, for no reason other than that it was right. The woman across the room who had just defended him to people who could make her professional life considerably more difficult had done it without calculating the return. That he understood now was the rarest thing in the building, possibly in any building. The evaluation came the following morning, Thursday, quiet and administrative, and almost invisible in how it was delivered. The intern cohort had been competing for 2 full-time associate positions, and the shortlist had circulated through the management layer before being passed to HR. Evelyn's name was not on it. Harrison found out the same way he found out most things during that week, through proximity, through being the kind of person that no one bothered to lower their voice around. He was in the service corridor adjacent to Patrick Sell's office when he heard the conversation through the half-open door. Patrick was speaking with the HR director, a woman named Carol, and the tone was the administrative blandness of people who have made a decision and are now doing paperwork around it. The phrase Patrick used about Evelyn was that she was talented, but not yet aligned with the leadership profile the company was trying to build at the associate level. He said she was more of a contributor than a driver. Carol made a sound of agreement and moved on to the next name on the list. The door to the corridor drifted slightly, and Harrison moved on before it opened fully. He went to the service alcove near the elevator on the 5th floor and sat there for a few minutes. More of a contributor than a driver. He turned the phrase over. In any honest language, it meant she does the work and doesn't perform the work, and we are rewarding the performance. He had built a company. He had signed policies, approved promotions, set cultural tone from the top of a 32-floor building. And this was what it had produced: a vocabulary of exclusion so smooth and professional that it didn't even sound cruel. Later that afternoon, he found the documents. He had not gone looking for them casually. He had gone looking for them deliberately, because the evaluation had moved him past observation and into the territory of evidence. He pulled the encrypted tablet from the bottom of the maintenance cart, logged in with his CEO credentials through a private connection, and navigated to the intern project folder on the company's internal drive. He was not doing this as Ryan Cole. He was doing this as the person who owned the system and had every right to examine it. He was simply doing it from a service alcove on the 5th floor instead of from his office on the 32nd. The version history on the project strategy document told him what he needed to know inside of 4 minutes. The original draft, dated 3 weeks earlier, carried the initials EC in the document properties. The current version, the one submitted to the leadership panel for review, carried no author trace at all. It had been saved through a clean export, the metadata stripped. But the version history was intact. Harrison could see exactly what had changed and when, and he could see that the routing interval model, the one Caleb had described as instinctive synthesis, the one Patrick Sell had called rare, had existed in its precise and complete form in Evelyn's original draft before Caleb had ever mentioned it in a meeting. The management layer knew. Not all of them, and not formally, but Harrison had seen enough organizational behavior to recognize the particular quality of attention that people pay to something they have decided not to see. They had decided not to see this. He locked the tablet and put it back in the cart. The final intern presentation was scheduled for Friday morning. It was a full leadership panel, senior directors, 2 VPs and the operations chief assembled in the main conference room on the 8th floor. The format was straightforward. The intern team would present the completed logistics strategy, take questions, and the leadership panel would use the session as part of the final evaluation for the associate positions. Caleb had been designated lead presenter. This had been arranged in the week prior, apparently at Patrick's recommendation communicated to the group as an acknowledgement of Caleb's project leadership. Evelyn had been assigned a support role, managing the slides, handling the data backup documents if the panel requested underlying figures. She would be in the room, but not at the front of it. Harrison learned this on Thursday evening, the last time he spoke with her, before everything changed. She was in the small conference room on the 5th floor, the one that had become, over the past week, the closest thing either of them had to a neutral space. She was not working on the presentation. She had finished what she needed to finish and handed it over. She was sitting with a coffee that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone who has arrived at the far end of a decision. She told him without much preface that she had decided to leave after the presentation. Not the room, the company. She said it flatly, the way you say something when you've moved past the emotional part of it and arrived at the logistics. She said she was grateful for the opportunity, but that she'd spent 2 months watching the things she built become the things someone else was celebrated for, and she didn't think another month would change the architecture of it. She was not angry, and Harrison believed her because the absence of anger in her voice was not suppression, it was exhaustion. The particular tiredness of someone who has been right about an unfair situation for so long that being right about it has stopped feeling like anything. Then she said something that caught him off guard. She said that before she left, she was going to correct the record not in front of the full panel, because she understood how that would be received, but in writing, submitted to HR directly after the presentation. She had already drafted it. She had documented the original version history, the timeline of contributions, and the sequence of meetings in which her framework had been verbally presented as someone else's work. She said she knew it probably wouldn't change the outcome, but she wasn't willing to leave without having said it clearly at least once. Harrison looked at her across the table. He thought about what he was about to do, and about whether telling her in advance was the right thing. He decided it wasn't, not because he wanted to keep her in the dark, but because what he needed from her tomorrow was the composure of someone who hadn't been given a reason to expect anything. He told her only that tomorrow was going to be different than she expected. She looked at him with a kind of tired skepticism, the look of someone who has been told that things will be different before. He didn't elaborate. He said only that she should be in the room and stay in the room whatever happened. Something in what she saw in his expression, something that didn't match the uniform, didn't match the mop cart or the name tag or any of the context she'd been given, made her nod slowly. She didn't ask why. She just nodded, and that was enough. Harrison pushed the cart out of the room and down the empty hallway toward the elevator. Tomorrow morning, the presentation would begin at 9. He had things to arrange before then. The presentation was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and Caleb Foster arrived at 8:40 with the particular energy of someone who had slept well and already decided how the day would go. He wore a new jacket. He had his slides printed as backup copies, which he distributed to the panel assistants with the smooth efficiency of someone who had rehearsed even the minor gestures. The 8th floor conference room filled in stages, directors settling into their chairs, the 2 VPs arranging their materials, the operations chief arriving last and taking the seat at the head of the long table. The intern group positioned themselves along the side wall. Evelyn sat at the far end, a laptop open in front of her. Her expression composed in the way of someone keeping something held carefully in place. Harrison entered from the service entrance at the back of the room at 8:55. He was still in the gray uniform. He moved the mop cart into the corner near the supply closet with the unhurried efficiency of someone who belonged there entirely. Nobody looked at him. He positioned himself near the wall and waited. Caleb opened the presentation at 9 exactly. He was good at this. Harrison could acknowledge that without bitterness, because it was simply true. Caleb knew how to command a room. He moved through the opening framework with confidence, made eye contact with each panel member in rotation. The senior directors leaned in slightly. The operations chief made a note. The presentation was polished and well-structured, and it was built almost entirely on a foundation that Evelyn Carter had laid before Caleb had contributed a single substantive idea to the project. At the 8-minute mark, something happened that Harrison had not anticipated. Evelyn's hand went up not dramatically, not as a disruption, but with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has decided that silence is no longer an option. Caleb stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. The panel looked at her. She said calmly and without apology that she needed to flag a discrepancy before the presentation continued. She said that the routing interval model being presented had originated in her draft, dated 3 weeks prior, and that she had documentation to support this, which she was prepared to submit to HR and to the panel directly. She said she understood this was an uncomfortable moment, but she was not willing to sit in the back of the room while her work was presented as someone else's for the second time that month. The room went very still. Patrick Sell's expression shifted. Caleb stood at the podium with the look of someone whose calculation had just failed in public. Harrison set down the handle of the mop cart. He walked to the front of the room and stepped into the space beside the projection screen. He reached up and unpinned the name tag that read Ryan Cole and placed it on the conference table. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the panel people he had hired, some of them, or approved the hiring of, and said that his name was Harrison Blake, that he was the CEO of Blake Horizon Logistics, and that he owed everyone in the room an explanation, starting with what they had just witnessed. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room full of professional people suddenly cannot locate the correct response. 2 of the directors looked at each other. Patrick Sell had gone very still. Caleb stood at the podium with his face cycling through several expressions before arriving at one that was essentially nothing, a careful blankness that people reach for when they don't yet know what they're being accused of or how much is known. Harrison connected his encrypted tablet to the projection system. He had spent the previous night compiling what he needed: version histories, metadata comparisons. The original document with Evelyn's initials embedded in the properties. The revised clean export with the data stripped and the timeline of every meeting in which concepts from that original document had been presented verbally by Caleb Foster before the rest of the intern team had seen the written framework. He put it all on the screen. He walked through it methodically the way he walked through any audit, without editorializing, without anger, letting the sequence of facts carry what needed to be carried. He also put on screen the evaluation notes from Patrick Sell's HR consultation, the phrase more of a contributor than a driver. The recommendation to remove Evelyn from the associate shortlist. He read it aloud and then let the room sit with it, and he watched Patrick Sell's expression do the difficult work of a man who has just seen a private judgment become a public one. Harrison told the room that this was not only the story of one intern taking credit from another. He said the real problem was that the system had been designed to make this outcome not only possible, but likely that they had built an environment where performing leadership was more visible and more rewarded than practicing it where the people who did the work were structurally separated from the recognition of it, and where the managers responsible for evaluation had decided, without apparent discomfort, that the performance was the point. He said he knew this because he had spent a week watching it from a position where no one felt the need to hide it from him. He said that was its own kind of answer. The operations chief, a steady man named Frank Greer, who had been with the company for 9 years, asked a single question when Harrison finished whether the documentation was complete. Harrison told him it was. Frank nodded once and looked down at his notes. That was the moment Harrison knew the room had landed where it needed to. There was a recess. The panel members stepped out. Caleb Foster left the room without speaking to anyone. Harrison stood at the front of the empty conference room and looked at Evelyn, who had not moved from her position at the end of the side wall. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely categorize. Not shock exactly, because something in it was too composed for that. Something closer to the recognition of a person who has just understood that a conversation they thought they were having was actually a different conversation entirely. She said his name, his real name, once quietly, as though testing the sound of it against everything she'd thought she knew. Harrison told her that he was sorry. He said it clearly, and without softening it into something more comfortable. He said that the company had failed her in a way that he had allowed, by being too far removed from the actual daily reality of the place, and that what she had experienced over the past 2 months was a consequence of a culture he had built and then neglected to maintain. He said he understood if that apology didn't mean much in its current form, and that he intended to follow it with something more concrete. He asked her if she was willing to remain in the room when the panel returned and present the project's core strategy as she had originally designed it. She looked at him for a long moment. The tiredness from the previous night had not entirely left her face, but something beneath it had shifted, not relief exactly, but the quiet resolution of a person who has just been told that the thing they were willing to fight for on their own is also worth fighting for together. She said yes. The panel returned 20 minutes later with a different quality of attention, the chastened, recalibrated focus of people who have just been reminded that oversight is part of their function. Frank Greer asked if there was additional material to present. Harrison gestured to Evelyn. She stood up. She didn't take the podium. She walked to the front of the room and stood beside the projection screen, the way someone stands when they know the material well enough that the slide deck is a courtesy rather than a crutch. She pulled up her original document and began from the beginning, from the problem statement she had defined 3 weeks before the project formally launched. And she walked the panel through every layer of the routing interval model, the initial flaw she'd identified in the peak hour variance accounting, the correction she'd built, the projected operational savings the revised model generated. She spoke without performance. She answered questions directly, including 2 that were pointed and technically demanding, and she answered them without checking notes. When she finished, Frank Greer looked at the operations data on the final slide and said that if the efficiency projections held at scale, the company was looking at a significant reduction in regional logistics costs. He asked how confident she was in the model's assumptions. She told him the specific variables she considered most sensitive, identified the 2 where she thought conservative adjustment was warranted, and gave him a revised range that was honest rather than optimistic. Frank Greer wrote it down. He thanked her by name. That was the entire room Evelyn Carter had been told she wasn't ready for. The weeks that followed were not simple. Harrison had not expected them to be. 3 managers, including Patrick Sell, were removed from their positions, not as a spectacle, but through a formal review process that Harrison personally handled with the administrative precision of someone who understood that accountability requires documentation, not theater. Caleb Foster resigned before any formal process reached him. HR processed his departure the same week. Harrison commissioned an external audit of the company's promotion and evaluation practices, not the self-reported culture surveys, but a forensic review of actual promotion, histories, evaluation language patterns, and the correlation between stated company values and measurable outcomes for employees who lacked internal sponsors or visible management relationships. The results were not flattering. He published a summary to the full company and held open sessions, 1 per building floor cluster, where employees could ask questions without a communications team filtering the room. Several of those sessions included questions that were direct to the point of being confrontational. A few were quietly specific in ways that told him the culture problem ran further back than he'd estimated. He answered what he could, acknowledged what he couldn't change retroactively, and committed to what he intended to do differently. He did not perform contrition. He reported facts and made commitments he intended to keep, which was the only version of accountability he had ever respected in anyone else. The structural changes followed over the coming months. A new evaluation framework gave direct contribution records, documented, time-stamped, version-tracked formal weight, alongside manager endorsements. A cross-level review board was established to flag promotions that showed patterns of recommendation without corresponding output evidence. The anonymous letter system was replaced with a formal whistleblower channel that routed to a board-level ombudsman rather than to HR, which had always reported to the same management layer it was meant to oversee. None of these were perfect solutions. Harrison knew that. But they were honest attempts to change the underlying incentive structure rather than the surface language, and that distinction was the only one that mattered to him anymore. Evelyn Carter accepted one of the 2 associate positions and came on full-time in the month following the presentation assigned to the operations division under Frank Greer, who had requested her specifically. By the 4th month, she was managing a small team of her own 4 analysts, a project scope covering 3 regional logistics hubs, and a reporting structure that gave her direct access to the decisions her work was informing. The people on her team respected her in the particular way that people respect someone who does not require them to perform anything other than their actual job. She still stayed late sometimes, not because she had something to prove, but because she was the kind of person who finishes what she starts. The difference was that no one who mattered anymore questioned what that was worth. Harrison was in the building late on a Thursday evening, not because he had nowhere else to be, though that had been true for a long time, but because there was work, and he was not yet fully in the habit of leaving before it was done. He had been making his way toward the exit through the 5th floor when he passed the hallway outside the small conference room, the one with the dragged-over desk lamp, the cold coffee, the quiet that had once been for him, the realest part of the entire building. The light was on inside. He looked through the glass panel in the door. Evelyn was in there, sitting across from one of her analysts, the 2 of them working through something on a shared screen, their body language easy and collegial. She was explaining something, and the analyst was leaning forward in the way people lean forward when the explanation is actually making sense. She looked like someone who had finally been allowed to occupy the space she had always been capable of filling. He did not knock. He watched for a moment, and then continued down the hallway. He was not wearing the gray uniform. He was not carrying a mop cart or a name tag with someone else's name on it. He pressed the button for the lobby and stood in the elevator with his hands in his pockets. He thought about what it had cost the entire circuit of it, from the anonymous letter to the gray uniform to the 8th floor conference room to the months of uncomfortable institutional repair. He thought about whether it had been worth it, and the answer that came back was not complicated. The woman in that conference room had done her work with honesty and care, and had been treated for 2 months as though those qualities were professional liabilities. The only reason anyone had corrected that was because she had, on a Wednesday evening at a forgettable office mixer, chosen to defend a man in a gray uniform when she had nothing to gain from doing so, and something real to lose. That was the whole of it. Not the audits, not the restructuring, not the forensic document review. Those were the scaffolding. The thing itself was smaller and more durable than any of that, the plain decision made by a person under no obligation to make it that someone else's dignity was worth defending. Harrison rode the elevator down. The lobby was quiet at this hour. He walked through it and out into the evening, and the building stood behind him with its lit windows and its complicated interior, running as it had always run on the accumulated choices of the people inside it.